Hey, we are back. We're going to go ahead and finish the radio chapter, and then, of course, we'll go ahead and provide you with your quiz. Now, because I decided to wait till Friday, your quiz won't be due until Monday at 8 p.m. Now, one of the things I finished up with is talking about the first ever broadcast radio network, and that, of course, was the National Broadcasting Company, or NBC. And, of course, others followed, and radio ruled. You had people would put a radio, and you'll see some of the pictures I attach here, would be in the center of their living room, and people would sit around the radio and listen to shows, listen to music, listen to speeches. As a matter of fact, one of the things coming out of the Depression in the early 1930s, after he was elected, President Franklin Roosevelt would use radio for what he referred to as his fireside chats, because again, people would typically by the fireplace have their radio and gather around at night to keep warm and of course to listen to what the president had to say as he was trying to pull us out of the Depression. And even though movies would start to become more prevalent into the early, mid, and then late 1930s, there was still no substitute in the home for radio. That's where you got your news. That's where if you were cooking, you could listen to music, or young people, if you were studying, okay, there was something to listen to, sports, all kinds of things. Matter of fact, it was kind of interesting, unlike today's radio, which we're going to get to in a moment, but when you had a radio station lineup, let's say, for example, Z100, when you had the lineup, it was like from 9 to 10 a.m. would be news. From 10 a.m. to 11 p.m. would be jazz music. From 11 p.m. to noon would be a kid show. From noon to 1 o'clock would be news. 1 to 2 o'clock would be discussion on today's topics, like a talk discussion show. And then all the stations were the same. All of them had this big mixed schedule. Okay? And that, of course, went through into the 1940s. Now, as you can see from some of the clips, radio had become so popular that, number one, a couple of guys on a radio show do a routine, and believe it or not, by the late 1930s, you actually had studio audiences for radio. That's why, we couldn't see the audience at home, but yeah, they would actually have a studio audience watching a radio show being broadcast. As a matter of fact, I'm going to leave you with a trailer also of a great Woody Allen movie that talks about, it's a Woody Allen movie, of course, talking about life, as he usually did, making fun of life's different things. But he centered it around his memory as a kid in the 1930s around the radio. And it's a really funny movie. And again, you could see all the different places where radio played such a big part in people's lives. But also getting news. One of the most powerful times for radio happened right after World War I started. Now remember, September 1st, 1939 is when World War I began. That, of course, is when Germany invaded Poland. And then, of course, 2 days later, Britain and France declared war on Germany. Yeah, we don't get into it until December of 1941 when the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. So for over 2 years, what was going on in Europe was so important to us here in America, and we would listen on the radio. Remember, back in the 1870s, they had laid down what's called the transcontinental cable. So basically, we could get the news feeds coming through that cable and then have it show up here in America. And as you can see from one of the links I sent you, a man by the name of Edward R. Murrow was a radio journalist for CBS Radio. And he would do his reports from London because, let's be honest here, that Nazi war machine pretty much wiped out all of Europe by the middle of 1940. And after taking France, now Hitler was saying, we're going to come after England. And he decided not to do a land invasion, but was going to try and, bomb them into submission. So there was almost every night, throughout 1940 and into 1941, Edward R. Murrow would sign on and say, "This is London." And then he would give these broadcasts and people would listen. People were scared. They really were. We actually started to go through air raid drills here, especially on the East Coast. There would be sightings of German U-boats off the coast of, New York or New Jersey or North Carolina. It was pretty crazy stuff. So now, after World War II, we get through World War II. It's now 1945. We're going into 1946. And there was an invention that they started working on before the war. Now, work on that invention continued furiously after World War II was over. Because remember, a lot of our resources went into the war. Like I said to you, you talk about cell phones. Those in World War II, boy, there were a lot of innovations when it came to electronics and radio. So, television arrives around 1948. And by 1950, television was the rave. I mean, again, it's visual entertainment. So now, as televisions were going into the living room, they were replacing the radio. And even though it was that typical small screen television, it didn't matter. It was the visual. See, we're always a visual being. We love to be entertained visually. You don't think so? Why did those Greeks build all those theaters back then? Okay, the old Greek theaters. That's the reason why. We love to be visually entertained. The Romans built the Colosseum. Why? Because they could go show up someplace and be visually entertained. We love to be visually entertained. And now to have that television in our home, well, kind of made radio obsolete. But here's the other thing. Television explodes. Well, where are we going to get the talent? Now we have all this television. We have all this time for programs. Well, we have to have some kind of programs. Well, who's going to do it? Well, where do we go? Let's go to radio. So all this radio talent now leaves television. So now radio's like, well, what the hell are we going to do? Well, that's when recorded music came in and said, hey, listen, let's make a deal. You play our records, and of course, you'll provide the distribution. And radio said, this is great because now we have programming. But remember how a radio schedule went, as I explained before? You had like a 1 hour for a talk show, 1 hour for this jazz music, an hour for a children's show. Well, how are we going to do this? Well, one guy in particular comes up with an idea. His name was Gordon McClendon. And what Gordon McClendon came up with, now he was down in Dallas, Texas. He was a programmer down there, did a couple of radio stations. And what Gordon McClendon came up with was an idea that, all right, now I run 5 stations in my little cluster here in Dallas. And this is what we're going to do. We're going to take station number 1. And station number 1 is only news. News, and that's it. Nothing else all day. No children's programming, no baseball, no jazz music, whatever. Station number 2, we're going to do nothing but country and western music. Station number 3, we're going to do nothing but today's pop music. Station number 4, we're going to do jazz music. And then station number 5, we're going to do nothing but classical music. We'll get a little Bach and Beethoven. All right. Now, what you're looking at, what McClendon came up with in the late 1940s, is what we refer to as format radio. Okay? Now, the reason why McClendon was so important is because that's what still exists today. Format radio. I mean, think about it. If you're listening to WFAN, which of course, as a lot of you may know, is the all-sports radio station in New York City, the number 1 radio sports station in America, is there an hour or two during the day where they suddenly play jazz music? No, of course not. Their format, and only format, is all sports. The same thing if I go to Hot 97. Am I going to hear me a little country twang from George Strait on, hey, it's George Strait, listen to my music on Hot 97 in New York? No, it ain't happening. All right? Because that's country music, whereas Hot 97 plays a more R&B, hot, I think it's more like a hot hip-hop or urban hip-hop, something to that effect is more of what their format is. But you're not going to hear country music on there. All right? So this is what McClendon came up with, which still very much exists today. All right? Now, one of the interesting things that I heard or read from a lot of your assignments that you guys handed in was the fact that, like, I don't listen to terrestrial radio anymore. Keep playing the same 10 songs all day, which is true. My 3 years at Mix FM, oh, by the way, I wanted to show you this. I still keep this. I'll never take this down. This was our bumper stickers. This was 100.7 Mix FM in Terre Haute, Indiana. And of course, if a listener came up and they did something that we wanted them to do, we'd give them a bumper sticker. Or of course, if you showed up with a Mix FM bumper sticker, you get a free CD wherever we were out and about. And it was a lot of fun. As a matter of fact, this is from one of our concerts we hosted. Okay, that of course is me, yes. A little lighter, more hair. And that is with R&B superstar Stevie B. Most of his hits were in the 80s. I think he had some stuff in the 90s, but Stevie B, great guy. And once in a while we mix it up a little bit just for our concerts. This is the first concert we ever hosted, and it had a bunch of different artists. This, of course, is me. This is my morning host. It was Bo and Mike in the morning. That was our morning radio show. And that guy in the middle, of course, is rock legend, who just recently passed away about a year or so ago. That's rock legend Eddie Money. And had a lot of fun. Probably one of my favorite memories from doing radio is this. We had a contest. And one of the record executives, he used to go to all different radio stations in the Midwest, and he had tickets to give away for the Grammys. We would auction them off in a contest. So like, oh, hey, if you're the 12th caller, or if you register every day, you may become the winner. And I ended up going with our winner to the Grammys in Southern California. We went to the Shrine Auditorium on the campus of USC, University of Southern California, and I got to see the 96 Grammys, which was pretty awesome, especially because a very special moment happened at that Grammys. The camera was off. They were actually watching from the audience when you're not home on television, watching how they change things up on the stage while they're focused only on the left-hand side where somebody's at a podium was amazing to watch. We're talking about 40 to 60 guys and women out there switching up the set, going from like this one set with TLC doing waterfalls to then Alanis Morissette with a grand piano and about 50 flowers, roses on it. It was just amazing to watch them do that. Well, anyway, so they're focused on the left-hand side, and it's Tupac. And Tupac says, this is the Grammys. We're not like other award shows. We like to do things differently. And then all of a sudden, who comes out for the first time in almost 20 years in full makeup and costume was Kiss. Now, for those who know, Kiss is more of a heavy metal band, so to have Kiss and Tupac together, it's on YouTube. It's a great moment. And I was there for it. I was screaming my head off. But anyway, so, radio is doing very well. And then sometime, even though it had been founded in 1939, sometime in the early mid-70s, that amplitude modulation, which is primarily what radio was, from the moment we founded radio, pretty much people stood to, the amplitude modulation where you sent it up and you let the natural waves of the earth take the signal. But all of a sudden, people finally started to discover that other bandwidth. And that was called frequency modulation, better known as FM radio. Okay? Now, with frequency modulation, which was different than, if you remember how I described amplitude modulation, where you'd send the signal up, it would be carried by the natural waves of the earth. With frequency modulation, okay, you'd send the signal, but it'd be a more direct signal. So it would be a strong, powerful, direct signal. Now, this signal, though, would not go up into the natural airwaves, so you'd only get a frequency modulation signal only for about 40 miles, and then it would just drop off completely. This is why, for example, if you're listening to your FM station, your favorite FM station, and then you go to the beach in Seaside, and suddenly you can't get your station anymore, all right? That's why, is because Seaside Heights is just far enough to be out of reach of the FM station in New York City. Sometimes you can get them, but most times you can't. But FM became very popular. So all of a sudden, you started to see radio stations drop off of AM and go over to FM. And a lot of music would go over there. A lot of talk would go over there. And suddenly, AM radio was dying off. But something saved it. Something saved radio. There's actually two kind of ideas. One I'd already mentioned, and that, of course, was sports radio. The other was conservative talk. When Rush Limbaugh, in 1988, arrived on the scene, his flagship station was WABC in New York, and he had 600 stations by the time he was done as his affiliates, and every day across the country, he ended up becoming the most listened to person in radio ever. What happened is that something really saved AM radio with both sports radio and with conservative talk. Does anybody know what their commonality is? And that's what saved AM radio. Is with both sports radio and conservative talk, it's audience call-in. Is now you had radio formats where the audience can actually participate. They can be a part of the show. And if you're ever listening to sports talk, WFAN or ESPN radio during the day, if you ever listen to WOR or WABC, which has conservative talk formats, they're taking phone calls all day. That's what they do. The audience is now a part of the show. And it saved AM radio. AM radio by the late 70s, early 80s almost was dead. Like almost no frequencies, no stations on AM radio. Boom. That's what saved it. Audience calling. All right, you guys. You have your quiz. You got till Monday, 8 p.m. And then next week, oh, it's my favorite. My favorite, I just wish we were in person, and that, of course, my favorite chapter being television. All right, we're going to talk a little bit about TV. You guys take care, have a great weekend. I want those quizzes in by Monday at 8 p.m.